Hello everyone.
This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It was a Tuesday morning when I first noticed something was off. I was rushing to get ready for work, coffee in hand, keys jingling as I approached my front door. As I went to lock up, the key wouldn't turn. I tried again and again, growing increasingly frustrated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it clicked into place. I brushed it off as just another annoyance in my hectic morning routine. But looking back, that was the moment everything started to unravel. Over the next few days, I kept having issues with my locks. Sometimes they'd work fine, other times they'd stick or feel different somehow. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something just felt wrong. I started to get this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach every time I came home. One night, I swear I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. I froze in terror, barely breathing, straining to listen. But then, nothing. Just silence. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of my recent divorce was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started double and triple checking my locks before bed. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I'd heard something. But every time I'd search the house, there was never anything out of place. About a week after the lock issues started, I came home to find my back door unlocked. I know I'd locked it that morning, I always do. That was when the real fear set in. I called a locksmith right away and had all my locks changed. For a few days, things seemed better. But then the problems started again. Keys not working, locks feeling different. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was I imagining things? Had the divorce really messed me up this badly? I confided in a friend, and she suggested I install a security camera. I was hesitant at first. It felt like admitting defeat, like I was letting my paranoia win. But eventually, I gave in. I set up a small camera in my living room, angled towards the front door. The first couple nights, nothing happened. I almost felt silly for installing it. But on the third night, that's when my worst fears were confirmed. I woke up to a notification on my phone. The camera had detected movement. With shaking hands, I opened the app and watched the footage. And there he was, my ex-husband, creeping through my living room in the dead of night. I felt like I was going to be sick. How long had this been going on? What had he done while I was sleeping? My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as he methodically removed the lock from my front door. He replaced it with a new one, pocketed the old lock, and left as silently as he'd come. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I called the police. They took my statement and reviewed the footage. They seemed concerned, but I could tell they didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. To them, it was just a domestic dispute gone too far. To me, it was my worst nightmare come to life. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and sleepless nights. They managed to track down my ex using neighborhood surveillance cameras. When they brought him in for questioning, he broke down and confessed everything. He'd been coming into my house for weeks, sometimes just to look around, sometimes to move things slightly out of place. He said he wanted me to feel unsettled, to make me doubt myself. The lock switching was his way of maintaining control, of reminding me that he could get to me whenever he wanted. Hearing all of this, I felt violated in a way I can't even describe. My home, the one place I was supposed to feel safe, had been invaded over and over again. The thought of him standing over me while I slept, it still makes me sick to my stomach. In the aftermath, I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Every creak, every shadow made me jump. I'd wake up in cold sweats, convinced he was there. Even though I knew he was in custody, the fear wouldn't leave me. I ended up moving across town, to a small apartment in a secure building. I changed my routine, my phone number, everything. But even now, months later, I still find myself checking the locks obsessively. I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, sure that I've heard someone in my home. The physical danger may be gone, but the psychological scars remain. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. How do you rebuild your sense of security when it's been shattered so completely? I'm sharing this because I want others to trust their instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking you're crazy or paranoid. Your safety and peace of mind are too important. And to anyone who's been through something similar, you're not alone. It's a long road to recovery, but we'll get there. One day at a time, one locked door at a time. I still don't understand why he did it. What was he hoping to achieve? Did he enjoy knowing he was terrorizing me? These are questions I'll probably never have answers to, and maybe that's for the best. For now, I'm focusing on healing, on reclaiming my sense of safety and autonomy. It's not easy, but I'm determined to not let this experience define me. I refuse to live in fear forever. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering what would have happened if I hadn't installed that camera. How long would it have gone on? What would he have escalated to next? The possibilities haunt me, but then I remind myself that I did catch him, that I trusted my instincts and took action, and in doing so, I took back control. It may not feel like it some days, but that was the first step in my journey to recovery. I know the road ahead is long, and there will be good days and bad days. But I'm hopeful. Hopeful that one day I'll be able to walk into my home without that twinge of fear. That I'll be able to sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. Until then, I'll keep moving forward, keep healing, keep fighting, because that's all any of us can do in the face of trauma. Keep going, one day at a time. To anyone reading this who might be in a similar situation, trust yourself, take precautions, reach out for help. You're stronger than you know, and you don't have to face this alone. And remember, healing isn't linear. Some days will be harder than others, but every day you get through is a victory. Hold on to that. As for me, I'm taking it one day at a time, learning to trust again, both others and myself. It's a slow process, but I'm getting there, and that's something no one can take away from me. I never thought I'd be the person living in constant fear and paranoia, but here I am. It all started about 3 months ago on what seemed like a normal Tuesday. I had just gotten home from my bartending shift around 2 a.m., exhausted as usual. All I wanted was to crash in bed, but something felt off as soon as I walked through the door. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The house looked the same. Nothing was obviously missing or out of place. But there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. I did a quick walkthrough of the rooms, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Everything seemed fine until I got to the kitchen. That's when I noticed it. The window above the sink was slightly ajar. I always keep that window locked, especially when I'm gone all night for work. My heart started racing as I realized someone must have been in my house. I grabbed a knife from the counter and searched every room, but there was no sign of an intruder. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there wasn't much they could do. No forced entry, nothing stolen, no fingerprints. They took a report, but basically told me to be more careful about locking up. I felt so unsettled that night, jumping at every little sound. I barely slept a wink. The next day, I installed a new deadbolt on the kitchen window and checked all the other locks obsessively. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time thing, maybe just some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew something more sinister was going on. A week went by, and I started to relax a little. Then it happened again. This time I came home to find muddy footprints on the kitchen floor. Someone had definitely been inside while I was at work. I called the police again, but it was the same story. No real evidence, no leads. I was beyond freaked out at this point. Who was coming into my house and why? What were they looking for? I started leaving work early, varying my schedule, anything to try and catch them in the act. But they always seemed to know when I'd be gone. It wasn't until about a month in that I finally discovered what they were up to. I had taken a rare day off and was up in the attic looking for some old winter clothes when I stumbled upon it, a small electronic device, carefully hidden behind some boxes. I had no idea what it was, but I knew it didn't belong to me. I took it to a tech-savvy friend, and he confirmed my worst fears. It was some kind of signal booster or Wi-Fi extender. Someone was using my house as a base for God knows what kind of illegal online activity. The realization made me sick to my stomach. Back to the police I went, device in hand. They took it more seriously this time, but still couldn't track down who was responsible. They said it was likely part of a larger hacking operation, using residential houses as cover. Great. So not only was I dealing with a break-in, but potentially dangerous criminals too. From that point on, I became obsessed with security. I installed motion sensors on every window and door. I got cameras for inside and outside the house. I changed every password I had and started using a VPN. I even considered moving, but the idea of starting over somewhere new was overwhelming. The invasion stopped after that, or at least I think it did, but the damage was done. I live in a constant state of hypervigilance now. Every creak of the house, every notification on my phone sets me on edge. I find myself checking and rechecking the locks multiple times a night. My friends tell me I need to relax, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But they don't understand. Once you've had your sense of safety and privacy violated like that, you can never go back. I'm always wondering, are they watching me? Will they come back? Have they moved on to another unsuspecting victim? I've become that person who jumps at shadows, who sees threats around every corner. I hate what this has done to me, how it's changed me, but I don't know how to stop. The fear has become a part of me now. Sometimes I think about quitting my job, finding something with normal hours so I'm not leaving the house empty at night. But then I wonder, is that what they want? For me to completely upend my life? I refuse to give them that satisfaction. So I stay, I work, I try to live some semblance of a normal life. But it's all a facade. Inside, I'm constantly on alert, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every time I come home, there's that moment of dread before I open the door. Will this be the day I find them inside? Or worse, will they be waiting for me? I've started having nightmares about faceless intruders. In my dreams, I'm always too late, always one step behind. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I've heard someone in the house. It takes hours to calm down enough to sleep again. The worst part is the not knowing. Who were they? What exactly were they doing? Are they still out there planning their next move? The police say there haven't been any similar cases reported, but that doesn't make me feel better. It just makes me wonder why I was targeted. I've become a regular at the hardware store, always adding new locks, new alarms, anything to feel a little safer. The employees probably think I'm crazy, but I don't care. They haven't lived through what I have. My dating life has taken a hit too. How do you explain to someone why you need to check every room before you can relax? Why you flinch at unexpected noises? I've stopped inviting people over altogether. My house doesn't feel like a home anymore. It's a fortress, a prison of my own making. There are moments when I think about packing it all in, selling the house and starting fresh somewhere new. But then the paranoia kicks in again. What if they follow me? What if the next place is even less secure? At least here, I know every inch, every potential entry point. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to work through some of this anxiety. She says it's a normal response to trauma, that it will take time to feel safe again. But how can I ever feel safe when I know how easy it is for someone to invade your space, your life? The rational part of my brain knows that the chances of it happening again are slim, but the fear doesn't listen to reason. It's always there, whispering worst-case scenarios, making me double and triple check everything. I find myself watching my neighbors now, wondering if they've experienced anything similar. Are their homes being used too? Should I warn them? But how do you even start that conversation without sounding completely unhinged? Sometimes I think I see unfamiliar cars parked on the street, or catch glimpses of someone watching the house. But when I look again, there's nothing there. Am I imagining things now? Has the fear completely taken over? I've considered reaching out to other victims of home invasions, trying to find some solidarity or understanding. But every time I start to type out my story, I stop. Putting it into words makes it all too real, too raw. So here I am, 3 months later, living a life I barely recognize. My once cozy home now feels like a fortress, my once carefree spirit replaced by constant vigilance. I tell myself it will get better with time, that eventually the fear will fade. But deep down, I'm not sure I believe it. Every day is a battle between the person I used to be and this new paranoid version of myself. I want so badly to feel normal again, to not flinch at every sound or shadow. But I don't know how to bridge that gap. For now, I take it one day at a time. I go to work, I come home, I check every lock and sensor. I try to find small moments of peace, of normalcy. But always, there's that undercurrent of fear, that knowledge that my sanctuary was violated and can be again. This is my life now, forever changed by a faceless intruder and a small electronic device. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover, ever feel truly safe again. But I'm trying. God, I'm trying. Because the alternative, letting the fear win completely, is unthinkable. So I keep going, keep fighting, hoping that someday, somehow, I'll find my way back to feeling secure in my own home. That evening, as I was grading papers at the kitchen table, I kept hearing odd noises, little thumps and creaks that I'd never noticed before. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside, but something felt off. I couldn't shake this eerie feeling of being watched. My cat Luna seemed on edge too. She kept staring intently at the wall near the entryway, her tail twitching. At one point she let out a low growl, which was unlike her. I got up to investigate, but didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Still, goosebumps prickled on my arms. I had trouble falling asleep that night. Every little sound made me jump. I tossed and turned for hours before finally drifting off into a restless sleep. I woke up exhausted the next morning, my nerves still on edge. The day dragged on at school. I was distracted and kept zoning out during lessons. My students definitely noticed something was off, but I brushed off their concerned looks. By the time the final bell rang, I just wanted to get home and relax. As soon as I walked in the front door that afternoon, Luna came running up to me, meowing urgently. She led me straight to the entryway closet, pawing at the baseboard. My heart started racing. With shaking hands, I pushed aside the coats and crouched down to take a closer look. That's when I saw it, a tiny gap where the baseboard met the wall, just big enough for a mouse, or for someone to peer through. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This had to be my imagination running wild, right? But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. With trembling fingers, I called my neighbor Mike, who's pretty handy with home repairs. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked if he could come take a look at some odd wiring in my closet. Mike arrived about 20 minutes later. I nervously explained what I'd been hearing and showed him the gap in the baseboard. He examined it closely, then started feeling along the wall. Suddenly, he paused. "Hey, does this section of wall feel different to you?" he asked. I ran my hand over the spot he indicated. The texture did seem slightly off compared to the surrounding area. Mike tapped it gently, and we both heard a hollow sound. "I think there might be a false wall here," he said quietly. "Want me to open it up?" I nodded, my mouth dry. Mike went out to his truck to grab some tools. When he returned, he carefully pried off a section of the baseboard, revealing a seam in the drywall. With growing dread, I watched as he cut along the seam. The section of wall swung open like a door, exposing a cramped pitch-black space behind it. The musty smell that wafted out made me gag. Mike shone his flashlight inside, and we both gasped. Crammed into the tiny space was a sleeping bag, some empty food wrappers, and a few articles of clothing. It looked like someone had been living in there. I stumbled backwards, my legs giving out. Mike caught me before I hit the ground. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Someone's been living in my walls." Mike immediately called the police while I sat there in shock, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police officers swarmed my house, dusting for prints and examining every inch of the hidden space. They confirmed that someone had indeed been living there, possibly for weeks or even months. But there was no sign of the intruder. I answered their questions in a daze, barely able to string together coherent sentences. How long had this person been there? Had they been watching me? The thought made my skin crawl. As the investigation wrapped up, an officer gently suggested I stay with a friend or family member for a few days while they continued searching for the culprit. I nodded numbly and called my sister to come pick me up. That night at my sister's house, I barely slept a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a stranger silently creeping through my home while I slept unaware. The violation of my personal space, my sanctuary, left me feeling utterly vulnerable. Over the next few days, I worked with the police and a home security company to completely seal off the hidden space and install motion sensors throughout my house. Logically, I knew the intruder was long gone, but I couldn't shake the paralyzing fear. It's been weeks now, and I still jump at every little sound. I've had countless nightmares about waking up to find a stranger standing over my bed. Some nights I don't sleep at all, instead sitting up with all the lights on, clutching Luna close. I've debated selling the house and moving, but the thought of starting over somewhere new is overwhelming. This was supposed to be my forever home, the charming old fixer-upper I'd dreamed of. Now it feels tainted, no longer the safe haven it once was. My friends and family have been incredibly supportive, but they can't truly understand the bone-deep fear I'm living with. How do you ever feel safe again, knowing that someone invaded your most private space without you even realizing? The police still haven't found any leads on who the intruder might have been, or how long they were living in my walls. Part of me doesn't want to know the details. I'm not sure I could handle it. But the not knowing is its own kind of torture. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking and rechecking that doors and windows are locked. I've become hyper-vigilant, analyzing every little sound or movement. It's exhausting, but I can't seem to let my guard down. Some days are better than others. I'm slowly trying to reclaim my space, to convince myself that my home is truly mine again. But then, I'll catch a glimpse of that sealed-off section of wall, and the fear comes rushing back. I know that rationally, the chances of something like this happening again are incredibly slim. But the knowledge that it happened once has shattered my sense of security. Will I ever truly feel safe in my own home again? Only time will tell. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, seeing a therapist to work through the trauma, leaning on my support system, and desperately hoping that someday this will all feel like a distant bad dream instead of my daily reality. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I'm not sure why I felt compelled to share it. Maybe in hopes that putting it out there will help me process it all. Or maybe as a warning to others to always trust your instincts if something feels off. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight. At first, everything seemed normal. Sure, the house was a bit creaky and drafty, But that's to be expected with these old places. I spent most of my time buried in books and research anyway, so I didn't pay much attention to my surroundings. That all changed one night when I was up late working on a paper. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard a strange scratching sound coming from the basement. My first thought was that it must be mice or something, but as I listened more closely, it sounded bigger, more deliberate. I tried to ignore it and focus on my work, but the noises kept getting louder and more frequent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way down the rickety basement stairs. The beam of light swept across dusty shelves and cobwebbed corners. Everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something odd. A stack of cardboard boxes that I didn't remember being there before. As I got closer, I realized the boxes were filled with all kinds of random items. Canned goods, toiletries, cleaning supplies. It was like someone had raided the clearance aisle at a dollar store. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. Footsteps creaking on the floorboards directly above me. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps were moving towards the basement door. In a panic, I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, praying I wouldn't be seen. The door slowly creaked open. A shaft of dim light spilled down the stairs as a dark figure began to descend. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I watched the shadowy form draw closer. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging everything into pitch blackness. I heard a muffled curse and the sound of someone stumbling on the stairs. Then rapid footsteps as the intruder bolted back up and out of the basement. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, afraid to move a muscle. When I finally worked up the courage to fumble my way back upstairs, I found the front door wide open, swinging in the night breeze. With shaking hands, I called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the property, but found no sign of the intruder. However, they did confirm my fears about the boxes in the basement. It turns out they were full of merchandise stolen from a nearby supermarket over the past few months. The officer told me it looked like someone had been using my basement as a temporary storage spot for their heists. They'd probably been sneaking in and out for weeks without me noticing. I felt sick to my stomach. To think that some stranger had been lurking just below my feet this whole time, coming and going as they pleased. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The next few days were a blur of police statements and sleepless nights. I kept imagining I heard noises, jumping at every little creak or groan of the old house. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the thief wouldn't be stupid enough to come back now that they'd been discovered. But I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, of no longer being safe in my own home. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. I installed new locks and motion sensor lights, but nothing could erase the knowledge that my privacy had been so thoroughly invaded. The final straw came about a week after the incident. I was doing laundry in the basement when I noticed something poking out from behind the dryer. It was a small notebook, filled with what looked like plans and schedules. Delivery routes for the supermarket, employee shift changes, security patrol timings. Seeing those meticulous notes made it all too real. This wasn't just some random break-in. Someone had been watching, planning, using my home as their personal command center for who knows how long. I couldn't take it anymore. That very day, I started looking for a new place to live. I found a small studio apartment in a secure building with 24/7 surveillance. It costs nearly twice as much as the old house, but it's worth every penny for my peace of mind. It's been a few months now since I moved. The police never caught the person responsible. Sometimes I still have nightmares about shadowy figures creeping through my home. I find myself constantly checking locks and looking over my shoulder. I know logically that I'm safe now, but I don't think I'll ever fully shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that at any moment my sanctuary could be invaded again. The scariest part is how long it went on without me noticing, how oblivious I was to the danger right under my nose. It's made me realize how vulnerable we all are, even in the places we think are safest. I still can't believe it happened to me. Some days it feels like a bad dream, but then I'll catch a glimpse of the headlines about more store robberies in my old neighborhood, and it all comes rushing back. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly secure again, but I'm trying to move forward, one day at a time. I just hope that by sharing my story, maybe I can help someone else avoid going through what I did. Always trust your instincts and never take your safety for granted. You never know what might be lurking just out of sight. I'd been living alone in my little cabin on the outskirts of town for about 5 years at that point. It was peaceful out there, surrounded by pine trees and silence. During the day, I ran my small bookshop in town, but evenings were for curling up by the fire with a good novel and a cup of hot cocoa. I loved the solitude, especially in winter when everything was blanketed in pristine white snow. That night started like any other. I closed up the shop around 6 p.m. as a heavy snowstorm was rolling in. The drive home was treacherous, my old pickup truck fishtailing on the icy roads as fat flakes obscured my vision. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the wind was howling and snow was coming down in thick sheets. I hurried inside, stamping the snow off my boots in the mudroom. The cabin was dark and chilly, so I got a fire going in the wood stove and turned on some lamps. Outside my windows, all I could see was a wall of white as the blizzard raged. I heated up some leftover chili for dinner and settled in with my latest mystery novel, grateful to be safe and warm inside while nature unleashed its fury. Around 10 p.m., I was just thinking about heading to bed when I heard it. A sharp, distinct knock at the front door. 3 raps in quick succession. I froze, my body instantly flooded with adrenaline. Who the hell could be out in this storm? And how did they even make it up my long, unplowed driveway? "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. No response. Heart pounding, I crept to the front door and peered out the peephole. All I could see was swirling snow in the glow of my porch light. No sign of anyone. I told myself I must have imagined it. The wind was fierce. A branch probably hit the door or something. I double-checked that the deadbolt was locked and headed back to the living room. But before I could even sit down, another knock came. This time from the back door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was no branch. Someone was out there circling my house. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaky. "I'm armed." A lie, but they didn't need to know that. Silence, just the roar of the wind. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously approached the back door. The small window was fogged with condensation. I wiped it clear with my sleeve and shone the light out into the yard. Nothing but white. But wait, there, at the edge of the beam, footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the door and disappearing into the whiteout conditions. My breath caught in my throat. This was really happening. Someone was out there, stalking around my house in the middle of a blizzard. I ran from window to window, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of the intruder. But the storm made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Another knock, this time at my bedroom window. I yelped and dropped the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. Scrambling, I found my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. I was on my own. For the next 2 hours, the knocking continued. Sometimes it was soft taps, other times violent pounding that rattled the windows. It moved around the house in no discernible pattern. Front door, side window, back door. Over and over. I huddled in the center of the living room, as far from the walls as possible. My eyes darted frantically from one entry point to another, terrified that at any moment a window would shatter or a door would splinter. Why were they doing this? What did they want? The questions raced through my mind, but I had no answers, just overwhelming, paralyzing fear. Around 1 a.m., the knocking abruptly stopped. The silence was almost as unnerving as the noise had been. Had they given up, or were they preparing for something worse? I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing, straining my ears for any sound. Eventually I realized the wind had died down. The storm was passing. As the faintest hint of pre-dawn light began to creep into the sky, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Footprints, dozens of them, circling my entire house. Some were deep, others just faint impressions. But they formed a complete perimeter around the cabin. Whoever it was had literally been walking circles around me all night long. But that wasn't the strangest part. Leading away from my driveway were two parallel lines in the snow, the tracks of a snowmobile. They disappeared into the trees, heading deep into the forest. I slumped against the wall, my legs giving out as the adrenaline finally faded. What the hell had just happened to me? The next few days were a blur. I reported the incident to the police, but with no real evidence beyond footprints, there wasn't much they could do. I installed security cameras and motion sensing lights all around the property, and I bought my first gun, a simple revolver that I now keep on my nightstand. It's been over 5 years, and nothing like that has happened again. But I've never felt truly safe in my home since that night. Every unexplained noise, every shadow in the yard, it all brings me right back to those terrifying hours. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the isolation and the storm played tricks on my mind. But then I look at those security cameras, at that gun by my bed, and I know it was real. Someone was out there that night. Someone who spent hours terrorizing me for reasons I'll never understand. And the worst part is, they're still out there somewhere, waiting, watching. I just pray they never come back. Still can't see my family's faces. It's been 3 months since that day on the frozen lake, but every time I close my eyes, all I see is that endless white expanse and the ghostly figure emerging from the snow. I know I should probably talk to someone about what happened, but who would believe me? Hell, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know it saved my life. It was early February, and I decided to go ice fishing despite the blizzard warnings. My dad and I used to go every winter when I was a kid, and after he passed away last year, I felt like I needed to keep the tradition alive. Maybe it was my way of feeling close to him again, I don't know. Looking back, it was a stupid, reckless decision. But grief does funny things to a person's judgment. I packed up my gear early that morning and drove out to Lake Superior. The wind was already whipping snow across the road, and I could barely see 20 feet in front of me. But I'd grown up in Duluth. I was used to harsh winters, or so I thought. By the time I got out onto the ice, the storm had picked up even more. I could barely stand upright against the wind as I trudged out to my usual spot about a quarter mile from shore. The world had shrunk down to a tiny bubble of white all around me. I couldn't even see the shoreline anymore. I set up my portable fishing shelter and got to work drilling my hole. The howling of the wind was deafening, drowning out the sound of my auger. As I worked, I kept getting this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. But every time I looked up, there was nothing but swirling snow in every direction. Finally, I got my lines in the water and hunkered down in my shelter to wait. Hours passed with no bites. The storm showed no signs of letting up. I was starting to think about packing it in when I heard it. A voice carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I nearly jumped out of my skin. I poked my head out of the shelter, squinting against the stinging snow, and that's when I saw him. About 50 yards away stood a man. At least, I think it was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed all in white. His face was obscured by the blowing snow, but I could feel his eyes on me. He raised one arm, pointing at me. "The ice isn't safe. You need to leave, now." His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I blinked, and suddenly he was closer, maybe 30 yards away now. I scrambled out of my shelter, heart pounding. "Who are you?" I shouted over the wind. "How did you get out here?" He didn't answer, just kept pointing at me with that outstretched arm. And then I heard it, a deep, groaning sound coming from beneath my feet. I looked down just in time to see a crack forming in the ice, spreading out from where I stood like a spider web. Pure terror jolted through me. I turned and ran, abandoning all my gear. The cracking sound pursued me, gaining ground with every step. I could feel the ice shifting and buckling under my feet. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My lungs were on fire, legs numb from cold and exertion. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw the shore looming out of the white haze. I staggered the last few yards and collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for breath. When I finally managed to lift my head and look back, I saw nothing but unbroken white. No cracks, no mysterious figure, just the storm, raging on. I sat there for a long time, shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. Who was that man? How did he know the ice was going to break? And where did he go? Eventually, I managed to stumble back to my truck and drive home. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. I scoured local news reports, looking for any mention of ice breaks or accidents on the lake. Nothing. I asked around town if anyone else had been out fishing that day. No one had. They all said I was crazy for going out in that storm. I've run through every possible explanation in my mind. Maybe I hallucinated the whole thing, some kind of stress-induced breakdown brought on by grief and isolation. But that doesn't explain the missing fishing gear. I went back out to the lake once the storm cleared, and there was no sign of my shelter or equipment. It's like it all just vanished. Part of me wonders if it was my dad somehow, watching over me from beyond. But that doesn't feel right either. Whatever I saw out there, it wasn't human. Not entirely, anyway. I haven't been back to the lake since that day. I can't bring myself to go near it. Sometimes I dream about it, that endless white expanse, that figure emerging from the snow. In my dreams, I'm not always fast enough to escape the cracking ice. I wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. I know I should be grateful. Whatever happened out there, it saved my life. But I can't shake this feeling of wrongness, like I glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. A corner of reality pulled back for just a moment, revealing something beyond my understanding. I've thought about moving away from Duluth, trying to put it all behind me. But something keeps me here. Maybe I'm hoping for an explanation, some key that will make it all make sense. Or maybe I'm just afraid that if I leave, I'll be leaving behind the last connection I have to my dad and our shared memories on that lake. All I know is that I'll never look at a frozen lake the same way again. And every time it snows, I find myself searching the white expanse for that tall, thin figure, warning me, watching me, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that day, but I do know this. There are things out there beyond our comprehension, things that lurk in the silence and the snow, and sometimes, if we're lucky, they reach out to save us from dangers we can't see coming. But at what cost? What happens when you've seen behind the curtain, even for just a moment? How do you go back to a normal life after that? I don't have any answers. All I can do is share my story and hope that maybe, somewhere out there, someone else has experienced something similar. That I'm not alone in this, that I'm not going crazy. And if you ever find yourself out on a frozen lake in the heart of winter, and you hear a voice on the wind telling you to leave, don't hesitate, don't question it, just run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because some warnings only come once. The ice isn't always as solid as it seems, and sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones we can't see until it's almost too late. I never thought a peaceful weekend getaway could turn into such a terrifying ordeal. It all started when I decided to rent a secluded cabin on Mount Hood for some much-needed rest and relaxation. As a construction worker, my days are filled with noise and chaos. so I was really looking forward to some quiet time alone in nature. When I arrived at the cabin on Friday evening, I was immediately struck by how isolated it was. The gravel driveway wound through dense forest for what felt like miles before finally opening up to a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was a quaint little place, all wooden logs and a rustic front porch. I breathed in the crisp mountain air and felt my stress start to melt away already. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. The cabin looked tidy enough at a glance, but then I noticed little things that seemed out of place. There were dirty dishes in the sink that definitely weren't mine. The bed was unmade, and when I touched it, the sheets still felt slightly warm, as if someone had just been lying there. A half-empty glass of water sat on the nightstand. I told myself I was being paranoid. The cleaning service must have just missed a few things, that's all. I unpacked my bags and tried to settle in, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. As night fell, the shadows in the cabin seemed to grow longer and darker. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards made me jump. I decided to distract myself by making dinner and having a beer on the porch. The cool night air helped calm my nerves a bit. I gazed up at the stars, so bright and numerous out here away from the city lights. It really was beautiful. Maybe I had just let my imagination run wild earlier. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. A soft thud coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I froze, straining my ears. For several long moments there was only silence. Then another faint noise. Was that a floorboard creaking? My heart began to race. I told myself it was just the cabin settling. Old houses make noises all the time. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it sounded an awful lot like footsteps. I barely slept that night. Every tiny sound had me bolt upright in bed, my eyes darting around the darkened room. I could have sworn I heard breathing once, so close it was like someone was standing right next to the bed. But when I turned on the light, there was no one there. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I was up and out of bed. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been all night until I felt my muscles protesting as I moved. I made a beeline for the coffee maker, desperate for some caffeine to clear the fog of my sleepless night. That's when I saw them. Muddy footprints leading from the back door out onto the porch. My blood ran cold. Those definitely hadn't been there the day before. With trembling hands, I opened the back door and peered outside. The footprints continued down the steps and off into the dense underbrush of the forest. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind reeling. Someone had been in the cabin while I was sleeping. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All those little signs I'd tried to rationalize away suddenly took on a terrifying new meaning. The dirty dishes, the rumpled bed. It wasn't just sloppy housekeeping. Someone had been living in the cabin, and they'd hidden when I arrived. I frantically began packing my things, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my bag. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lunging at me from some hidden corner of the cabin. I've never moved so fast in my life as I did loading up my car that morning. As I peeled out of the driveway, my tires kicking up gravel, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I imagined the intruder watching from the tree line as I fled, maybe even now emerging from their hiding place to reclaim the cabin. The thought made me shudder. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars and people. I called the rental company as soon as I had cell service again to report what had happened. They seemed skeptical at first, but promised to send someone out to check on the property. I don't know if they ever found any evidence of the intruder. Part of me doesn't want to know. It's been months since that weekend, but I still have nightmares about it sometimes. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear breathing in the darkness of my bedroom. I've become hyper-vigilant about locking my doors and windows. I don't think I'll ever be able to stay in a remote cabin again. The scariest part is not knowing who was in that cabin or why. Were they just a squatter looking for a free place to crash? Or someone more dangerous, I can't help but imagine all the terrible things that could have happened if they'd decided to confront me instead of sneaking away in the night. I used to love the peace and quiet of nature. Now, the thought of being alone in the wilderness fills me with dread. I keep wondering, if I go somewhere isolated again, how can I ever be sure I'm really alone? That weekend changed me in ways I'm still coming to terms with. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. It was late afternoon, and I had been driving for hours along winding mountain roads. The snow was coming down harder, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I probably should have turned back earlier, but I was determined to reach this vista point I'd read about online. As the storm intensified, I realized I had made a huge mistake. My little sedan was struggling in the deepening snow. The tires kept spinning, barely getting any traction. I knew I needed to find somewhere safe to pull over and wait out the storm. But there was nowhere to go, just steep drop-offs on either side of the narrow road. Panic started to set in as I inched forward, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The wind howled, rocking my car. Snow pelted the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. Finally, I spotted a wider shoulder area and managed to pull over. I let out a shaky breath, realizing how tense I'd been. At least I was off the main road now. I shut off the engine to conserve gas and tried to relax. The silence was eerie. No other cars had passed by in ages. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal up here. I was completely cut off. How long would this storm last? Did anyone know where I was? My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. After about 30 minutes, I saw headlights approaching through the whiteout conditions. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was a snowplow or police vehicle that could help. But as the vehicle got closer, I realized it was just an old pickup truck. It pulled up behind me and stopped. Through my rearview mirror, all I could make out was a dark silhouette in the driver's seat. Why weren't they passing? Maybe they wanted to check if I needed help. I waited, but nobody got out. The truck just idled there, headlights boring into my mirrors. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. Something didn't feel right about this. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a car door open and slam shut. Footsteps crunched in the snow, getting closer. My heart started racing. Should I lock the doors? But what if they really were just trying to help? A figure appeared at my window, barely visible through the frosted glass. They knocked, making me jump. Hesitantly, I cracked the window a few inches. "You all right in there?" a gruff male voice asked. I could smell cigarette smoke on his breath. Yeah, I'm fine," I stammered. "Just waiting out the storm. Thanks for checking." "Storm's only gonna get worse," the man said. "Why don't you hop in my truck? I can give you a ride to town." Every instinct told me not to trust this stranger. "That's really nice of you, but I think I'll be okay here. I've got plenty of gas and supplies." He was quiet for a moment. "You sure about that? It's gonna be a long, cold night out here. My truck's got four-wheel drive. I can have you someplace warm in no time." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I appreciate the offer, but really I'm all set. Thanks anyway." He didn't move away from the window. "Come on now, don't be foolish. It ain't safe out here all alone. Why don't you—" I said no thank you. I cut him off more forcefully. "Please leave me alone." I started to roll up the window, but he grabbed the edge. "Now listen here." Adrenaline surging, I slammed down the lock button and rolled the window up the rest of the way, nearly catching his fingers. He pounded on the glass, shouting something I couldn't make out. I was shaking uncontrollably. To my horror, instead of leaving, the man went back to his truck. But he didn't drive away. He just sat there, engine idling, headlights glaring at me. I was trapped. Hours crawled by. The storm raged on outside. Every so often I'd hear the man's truck door open and slam shut as he got out to pace around. Sometimes he'd come rap on my window again. I stayed huddled in my seat, ignoring him. My mind raced with terrible possibilities. Was he waiting for me to fall asleep? To run out of gas? What would he do then? I kept the doors locked and my hand on the key, ready to start the engine and try to flee if I had to. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. I ran the car periodically to stay warm, acutely aware of my dwindling gas gauge. The man in the truck showed no signs of leaving. I was exhausted but terrified to sleep. Every time I dozed off, I'd jerk awake in a panic, certain he was trying to break in. The wait became psychological torture. Why wouldn't he just go away? Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I noticed the snowfall finally starting to let up. A faint glow on the horizon told me dawn wasn't far off. Had I actually made it through the night? Suddenly I heard the man's truck roar to life. My whole body tensed. What was he going to do? To my utter disbelief, he simply drove away, disappearing into the swirling snow. Just like that, it was over. I sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had happened. As soon as it was light enough, I got out to clear the snow from my car. My legs were weak and shaky. Every sound made me flinch, convinced the truck was coming back. But the road remained empty. I managed to get the car moving and crawled along at a snail's pace until I reached the main highway. Plows had been through, and I was able to make it into Taos. Desperate for a hot meal and human contact, I stopped at a small diner on the outskirts of town. As the waitress poured my coffee, I hesitantly asked if she'd heard about any stranded motorists during the storm. Her face went pale. "Oh, honey, you're lucky to be alive. There's been talk lately of a man in an old pickup who stops to help people stuck in the snow. But the ones who accept never make it to town, if you know what I mean. Police can't find any proof, but too many folks have gone missing up in those mountains." I felt sick. The full weight of how close I'd come to God knows what hit me like a punch to the gut. I thanked the waitress and quickly left, unable to eat. It's been months now, but I still have nightmares about those endless hours trapped in my car, that menacing truck looming behind me. I can't shake the feeling that if I'd made one wrong move, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Sometimes I wonder, was it really just a kind stranger offering help, and my paranoia got the best of me? But deep down, I know my instincts were right. Whatever that man's intentions were, they weren't good. I don't know why he finally left, or what would have happened if the storm hadn't broken when it did. All I know is I'll never take another winter road trip alone again. And if you find yourself stranded in a snowstorm, for the love of God, don't accept rides from strangers. Around 11 p.m. we pulled over at a small rest stop off the highway. Most of us were half asleep, but I really needed to use the bathroom. As I stepped off the bus, the bitter cold hit me like a wall. The snow was coming down in thick flurries, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I hurried towards the restroom building, head down against the wind. That's when I heard it, a soft, echoing voice calling my name. I looked up, squinting through the snow. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw a faint blue glow. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out a figure, shimmering and translucent. My first thought was that I must be dreaming. I rubbed my eyes, but the figure was still there. It called out again, beckoning me closer. Against all logic, I felt drawn to it. My feet started moving of their own accord, trudging through the deepening snow. As I got closer, I could see it more clearly. A woman, I think, with long flowing hair that moved as if underwater. Her skin and clothing were various shades of pale blue and white. She was beautiful, but in an otherworldly, unsettling way. Her eyes were completely white, no pupils or irises. She reached out a hand towards me, still calling softly. I knew I should turn back, but I couldn't look away. It was like I was in a trance. The falling snow seemed to slow down around me. I felt so cold, but also strangely peaceful. I had almost reached her when I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me backwards. I blinked, snapping out of whatever spell I'd been under. It was Coach Miller, looking furious and scared. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled, barely audible over the howling wind. "Get back on the bus now!" I turned to look back at the woman, but she was gone. There was nothing there but trees and swirling snow. Confused and shaken, I let Coach drag me back to the bus. As we climbed aboard, I realized I was shivering violently. My clothes were soaked through with snow. How long had I been out there? It had felt like only moments, but it must have been several minutes at least. Coach wrapped me in a blanket and sat me down, still looking worried and angry. "You trying to freeze to death out there?" he demanded. "What were you thinking wandering off like that?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. It all seemed so hazy and dreamlike already. Had I imagined it? Maybe I'd been sleepwalking or hallucinating from exhaustion, but it had felt so real. The other guys on the team were staring at me. A few asked if I was okay, but I just nodded silently. I didn't know how to describe what had happened. I wasn't even sure myself. As we pulled back onto the road, I kept replaying it in my mind. The glowing figure, the hypnotic voice, the strange calm I'd felt. None of it made sense. I tried to convince myself it had just been my tired mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The next day at the tournament, I was distracted and off my game. I lost my first 2 matches, which had never happened before. Coach pulled me aside, asking what was wrong. I still couldn't bring myself to talk about it. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? That night in the hotel, I overheard some of the local guys talking. They were swapping stories about something called frost ghosts, spirits that supposedly lured people out into blizzards, never to be seen again. My blood ran cold. It sounded exactly like what I'd experienced. I wanted to ask them more, but I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. So I just lay in bed, unable to sleep, going over and over it in my head. What if Coach hadn't grabbed me when he did? Would I have followed that thing into the woods and disappeared forever? The rest of the trip passed in a blur. I managed to win my last match, but my heart wasn't in it. I just wanted to go home and try to forget the whole thing. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of those glowing white eyes and that haunting voice calling my name. I've done some research since then on frost ghosts and similar legends. Apparently, there are stories from all over the world about spirits that lure travelers to their doom in snowstorms. Some say they're the ghosts of people who died in blizzards. Others claim they're some kind of ancient nature spirits. I don't know what to believe. Part of me still wants to write it off as a hallucination or waking dream, but it felt too vivid, too real, and the coincidence with the local legends is hard to ignore. I haven't told many people about this. Even writing it out now, I worry it sounds completely insane. But I know what I saw and felt that night. Something was out there in that snowstorm, something not of this world, and for some reason, it wanted me. I still wrestle, but I get nervous whenever we have away matches in snowy areas. I find myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that blue glow again. So far, nothing. But I can't shake the feeling that it's out there somewhere, waiting. If you're ever driving through a snowstorm and see a strange light in the woods, or hear a voice calling you, don't follow it. No matter how drawn to it you feel, fight the urge. Get back in your car, or get inside somewhere safe. Because there are things out there in the blizzard that we can't explain. Things that want to take us away to places we were never meant to go. I was lucky. Coach saved me that night. But I can't help wondering how many others weren't so fortunate. How many people have vanished into the snow, lured away by those haunting voices and ethereal lights. It chills me to think about. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me that night. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe there's a rational explanation I haven't thought of. But deep down, I know the truth. I came face to face with something beyond our world, and only by sheer luck did I escape to tell the tale. So be careful out there in the winter wilderness, and if you ever find yourself drawn to a strange glow in a snowstorm, fight it with everything you have. Your life may depend on it, because the frost ghosts are real, and they're always hunting for new souls to claim. It started when I got a call from this couple, Richard and Pamela, about a